our Washington law firm. We have 2 other law firms that help with other issues. If you're a member, you know how to take advantage of our legal hotline. If you're a station, because this is an opportunity we're giving to all radio stations, whether they're members or not, we want to thank you and remind you that there's lots of things and advantages of being a member of the GAB, and we'd love a chance to talk to you about that. The license renewal is the most important thing. If you don't have your license, you can't continue to do all the great things you do to serve your communities. So I want to thank you all for being here on the line and taking this very important matter serious. At this time, I'm just going to say thank you for being here today, and we're ready to help you in any way we can at the GAB for the next 3 weeks going into license renewal and anytime after that for other things that we provide. I'm going to turn it over to Mackenzie now, and she'll give you the last minute instructions, and then Dave can start.
Yep, so just make sure that everyone mutes themselves until we're ready for questions. And just a reminder, you can also submit questions using the chat feature at the bottom part of your screen. And the last thing is to make sure that you are not sharing your screen or submitting any video to us, because then it will kick off the PowerPoint presentation, which hopefully everyone can see in front of them here. So now I will turn it over to David O'Connor and David Oxenford.
Great. Hi, this is Dave Oxenford. I'll be sort of doing the play-by-play, and David O'Connor will be adding some color commentary. We're also expecting John George, who's your alternate broadcast inspector, to be throwing in some comments as we go along here this afternoon. Thank you all for joining us here today. And Kenzie, if you go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about some of the issues that we'll be talking about this afternoon. As we say on the second slide, you may remember license renewal because license renewal, but some of you may not remember license renewal given the typical turnover at radio station staffs. The last license renewal for most of you were granted back in 2012. It's an 8-year license renewal cycle, so lots of things have changed during that period. As we go through some of the details of license renewal, probably the biggest change is the fact that we've got the online public inspection file, and that creates all sorts of potential problems for you going forward. The FCC has a 3-year license renewal cycle where they go through a couple of states every other month. They started this license renewal cycle with stations in the mid-Atlantic states in June, and that's Virginia, West Virginia, the District of Columbia, and Maryland. And I see our slides are not advancing. I'm not sure what we do about that, but we'll keep talking and certainly send you the slides later on.
Yeah, Mackenzie, is there a chance we can get the next slide up?
Yeah, it's not mirroring on the presentation. I've moved it, but it's not going over to the next slide. But everyone should have been emailed a copy of the presentation this morning as well. So if you're having trouble with it like we are, you can also follow along with that from your email.
Okay, great.
In any event, the FCC has started the license renewal cycle with the states here around Washington, D.C. We've already seen a couple of FCC fines for some of the stations that had some problems, and we'll talk about that in a few moments. Most of what we're going to be talking about here today are things that we certainly hope that you've already gotten a start on, because your license renewal is due on December 2nd of 2019. It would normally be due on December 1st, but that's a Sunday, so it kicks over to the next day for radio this year. TV is 1 year behind, so stations in Georgia will be filing on December 1st of 2020 for TV. It's important that you start thinking about all these issues now. Don't wait till Thanksgiving week to start doing your license renewal, because you're bound to run into some problems. One of the problems may be using the FCC's filing system, the LMS filing system. It's not the CBDS filing system that you may be very familiar with that you've used in the past for all your applications and assignment applications and technical applications. The FCC is moving everything for radio over to LMS slowly. For radio, you probably remember filing your biennial ownership reports last year in LMS. You have a biennial ownership report that's now due also to be filed in LMS. Recently, the FCC moved over all FM construction permit applications to LMS, and now the license renewals will be filed in LMS. So make sure you know how to use that system so you're ready to file when you've got the preparations taken care of. As I mentioned earlier, we've got online public inspection file obligations this time around, which means basically the FCC and anybody else, anywhere else, can see what your public file says and whether you've updated everything in your public inspection file as you're supposed to have done. There are going to be lots of issues that we'll be talking about here this afternoon to certify about many aspects of your station operations, including whether or not your station is currently on the air and whether or not it's been off the air for any significant period of time in the past. Hopefully you're quite aware of whether or not you're on the air, but it is a question that the FCC asks about and can be a concern if, for instance, you've got an AM station that you've been keeping off the air for long periods of time and only turning it on once or twice a year to make sure that you keep that license. So there are lots of little issues that can get you into trouble. We'll be running through a lot of those issues. So make sure you start right now to get everything ready for the December 2nd filing, or you can file today if you're all ready. There's no reason to wait to December 2nd. In fact, as there can be internet problems, there can be problems with the FCC's filing system, so it's always good to file early if possible. So some of the specifics we'll be talking about, some of the reminders we'll be giving you. We'll talk about the importance of getting your license renewed, why you can't do without it. We'll talk about the EEO requirements that you'll be making some certifications for and some additional information that you'll be providing with the license renewal form. We'll be talking about the online public inspection file and most particularly the quarterly issues programs lists, which have been the source of the most fines in the last renewal cycle and already for 2 significant fines during this license renewal cycle. We'll talk about the other license renewal certifications you need to keep in mind and need to certify to on the license renewal form. We'll talk about the steps that you need to take prior to the renewal filing, some of which should already be underway, including pre-filing announcements, which we'll be talking about in a few moments. And then finally, how the renewal will play out and give you a look at the form itself in case you haven't already seen it. On the next slide, we talk about why the license renewal is so important. Basically, the license renewal is so important because it's basically vital to the operations of your stations. If you don't file, the FCC can take away your station's authority to operate. And if you file late, the FCC may well fine you. If you file too late, they can take your station license away. We've just seen a couple of licenses over the last month or so being canceled from the last license renewal cycle because people either didn't file or filed incredibly late. Also important to think about is the fact that the FCC will not permit you to close on a sale or a purchase of a station while the license renewal is pending. So if you've recently had a sale granted of your station, make sure you get it closed before the December 1st filing deadline, or else you will not be able to close it until about 4 months later when your license renewal is granted. If you're planning on buying a station and Georgia or Alabama, coming up here with the renewals due in December. You're not going to be able to get a grant and close on that again for about 4 months. If you're looking to buy any stations in some adjacent states that have not yet got their license renewals, take a look at those license renewal deadlines and plan your buying or selling activity to avoid that dead period of the 4 months while the license renewal is pending. One of the first obligations we discuss on the next slide, and that's EEO. Every application of a full power station, an AM or an FM station, is scrutinized for your EEO compliance with the FCC's EEO rules, and that goes for non-commercial stations as well. The rules, the detailed rules for EEO don't apply to station employment units with fewer than 5 full-time employees. A station employment unit is basically any station under common control operating in the same general geographic area that have 1 or more common employees. So an AM and an FM that operate in the same town and have the same general manager as an employment unit. If you've got 3 FMs and an AM in the same area with the same sales manager that are under common control, and that's an employment unit. If you've got 5 full-time employees, that's 30 hours per week over those 4 stations. You're subject to these EEO rules. Even if you don't have 5 full-time employees at your employment unit, you'll still have an EEO obligation at renewal time to file the FCC Form 396. For those stations with fewer than 5 full-time employees, what that means is you basically put in the Form 396, provide the information, including a contact person at the station, the information about the station, address, telephone number, and that sort of thing. Certify that you've got fewer than 5 full-time employees, and also make a certification that you haven't had any EEO complaints or don't have any EEO complaints that are currently pending. That's any sort of discrimination complaint filed with the FCC, filed with the State Employment Commission, filed with the EEOC, the Federal Employment Commission, or with anybody else alleging any sort of discrimination. Even if you've got fewer than 5 full-time employees, you have to make that certification, or if you do in fact have some discrimination claims pending or have been resolved adversely to you, you need to report on those on this Form 396. For stations with more than 5 full-time employees, in addition to providing the information about EEO complaints and the general information about the station and the contact person, you also need to provide 2 years of your annual EEO public inspection file reports. Those are the annual reports that you put in your public inspection file on December 1st of each year. So the one that you'll be putting into your public inspection file on December 1st of this year needs to go with the renewal, and the one that you did in December 1st of last year needs to go with your Form 396.
And those EEO reports also have to be put on the station's website to the extent that your station has a website. So keep that in mind too. They need to go in 2 places, into your online public file and onto your station website.
Or the station website can have a link directly to the report in your online public inspection file. But it does need to be referenced somewhere on the front page of your station's website so that somebody coming there can just click on that link and see your public inspection file report. And basically the requirements for that public inspection file report is to report on the information as to how you widely disseminate information about all job openings, with certain exceptions for unique circumstances, And that's going to be very rare that you're not going to have information about wide dissemination, because the only exceptions are essentially situations where you targeted a particular individual, like the best salesperson at the station across the street is suddenly deciding that they don't like the manager at that station and looking for a new home, and you don't have an opening at your station, but this person is so qualified that you want to bring into your station. The FCC will consider that as an exception to outreach requirements. But for anything other than a position that you basically create because there's a uniquely qualified individual who you suddenly find out is available, for any other job opening, you should be widely disseminating information to allow people from outside of your station, outside of word of mouth, learning about the job, to other sources to send applicants your way. These can now be online sources, monster.com, jobs.com, LinkedIn, whatever online sources may work in your area. It can be other media in your area, newspapers, it can be college organizations, employment offices, civic associations. Just make sure the word is getting out to these other organizations, and they are referring people who you interview back to your station. What the FCC will be looking at in reviewing these public filing reports is to see that there are sources that you're using to publicize all your job openings, and that you're actually getting interviewees from outside, what they refer to as the old boys network, word of mouth recruiting, or just referrals from your consultants or sister stations. Also, make sure that your annual EEO reports have been uploaded into your online public inspection file. Oh, the other thing that those public inspection file reports should be listing is all of the outreach activities that you're doing, whether or not you've had any job openings. That includes things like going to job fairs, having Boy Scout troops or others come into your station where you educate them about the job positions at a radio station, activities where you go to educational institutions to talk about jobs at a broadcast station, or go to civic organizations and talk about employment opportunities at at radio stations, where you have mentorship programs or internship programs, where you yourself are funding and involved in setting up and running a scholarship program. All of these qualify as these supplemental activities that you need to be doing, whether or not you've got any job openings, and documenting them in your public filing reports. Great. Now, in addition to EEO, you also need to make sure that your public inspection file is up to date and accurate, because everybody is watching. Certainly the FCC will be reviewing your public inspection file when they're looking at your license renewal application. And as I said earlier, anybody, anywhere can be reviewing your public inspection file. So if there's somebody who has a beef with your station, they no longer have to tromp on down to their main studio and look for that paper public inspection file. All they've got to do is call, turn on their computer, search WXYZ public inspection file, and it will pop up in Google, usually as the top search result. We worry, and it hasn't happened yet in the first couple of license renewal cycle, but we worry that there are public interest groups that haven't liked some of the FCC's deregulatory actions over the last couple of years, and they may pipe in at some point during the license renewal cycle and start reviewing stations' public inspection files. You know, they can do it now from their kitchen table with a cup of coffee and their pajamas, and fuzzy slippers and look at your public inspection file and determine whether or not you filed everything that you need to file. And not only whether you filed everything that you need to file, but whether you did it on time. Because everything that you put into your online public inspection file is date stamped. Now, this is going to include information about your biennial ownership reports. These will be in your online public inspection file. There'll also be a certification that you'll have to make in the license renewal application that you filed your biennial ownership reports. You should have filed a biennial ownership report that was due for ownership as of October 1, 2017, because the FCC was transitioning to the LMS system. That was actually filed in early 2018. You've got one that's due reporting on your ownership for 2019 as of October 1 of 2019. That window for filing that ownership report just opened on November 1st. You have a deadline of January 31st to get that biennial ownership report uploaded to the FCC's LMS system so that when the FCC is reviewing your license renewal, they can see that you've in fact filed those biennial ownership reports. This applies to commercial and non-commercial stations, so make sure that they're there. The FCC will be uploading pending applications that you may have for technical changes. They'll be uploading the license renewal itself to your online public inspection file once you file that license renewal. But check your online public inspection file, because even though the FCC is supposed to be uploading these applications, once in a while the system breaks down and those applications don't make it into your online public inspection file. And it's your obligation to make sure that those public inspection files are complete and accurate, even if the FCC messes up on it.
And one thing that we have seen is that stations don't always have a copy of their FCC license and a copy of their most recent renewal card in their online public file. And that is just a glitch that the FCC's website has had. So if you see on your own station's website that you don't have your license and or you don't have your renewal card, go ahead and upload it manually to your online public file to make sure your file is complete.
Yeah, take a look at that online public inspection file. Go through your own online public inspection file before you file the renewal to make sure everything is there. We've even seen situations where coverage maps are the wrong coverage map. So instead of a station in Georgia, it's one in Colorado. That, again, maybe a call letter or two got somehow messed up and the FCC uploaded the wrong coverage map to your online public inspection file. So make sure everything is uploaded correctly and is there. We'll talk about the quarterly issued programs list in just a moment. Also make sure that you're uploading your political file documents. That's including all the information every time you get a purchase from a candidate for political advertising, where you've got to upload the name of the candidate who's purchased the time, information about the price that they're being charged, the classes of advertising time that you sold to them, the schedule on which the advertising time is supposed to be running. Once that schedule has run, the exact times at which the spots ran are supposed to be uploaded, and that's required for all candidate ads and any federal issue ads. For state issue ads, you don't need to have the price information and the schedule information, but you do need to identify the organization. For federal issue ads or state issue ads, you also need to have an address of the organization that's sponsoring those ads in your public inspection file, a contact person and telephone number for the organization sponsoring the ads in your public inspection file, and a list of the chief executive officers or the board of directors of the organization that's sponsoring those third-party ads about elections or about state or federal issues. The FCC just came out with a couple of decisions a few weeks ago that make it very clear that it's your obligation to inquire of organizations that sponsor political ads about their board of directors or officers. If they only give you a single name in connection with a political buy, you've got an obligation to reach out to them and see if in fact they've got more than one officer or director, as most organizations in fact will have more than one. You've at least got to ask the question, do you have more than one officer or director, either of the organization or of the advertising agency that placed that buy? The FCC has also said that on federal issue advertising, you've got to identify all of the issues that federal ad addresses in your public inspection file. And that may be multiple issues. If, for instance, a PAC comes in during political season, buys advertising time to attack a candidate for the House of Representatives, and in that attack on the candidate for the House of Representatives, they say, oh, this guy is soft on immigration. He's voted against the president's border wall, so he wants to open our country to invasion from aliens. Plus, he's a big spending liberal and wants to raise your taxes and voted against all these bills to limit your taxes. When a PAC buys that ad, you've got to list the candidate that they're attacking. You've got to list the office that candidate is running for. You've got to list the fact that the attack ad addresses immigration as an issue, and you've got to list the fact that it addresses taxation as an issue in the example that I just gave. So that means that you've got to be looking at these ads to figure out what issues they address.
And for all of these political documents, timing is really important. These files come in all the time. We're aware of how much political orders come in, especially as we get closer to the election. But the FCC's rule is they have to be uploaded the same day you get the order or the next business day that you get the order. So again, as Dave said, there is a timestamp every time you upload something to your online public file. And the FCC is going to compare the date on the order to the date that you uploaded it. And if those dates are not the same, you're going to have to make a disclosure in your renewal application.
Also required to be in your public inspection file are contracts relating to station ownership and control. Things like articles of incorporation, bylaws, any document that gives somebody a future ownership interest or a possible future ownership interest. That would be include an option agreement, any sort of stock pledge agreement, any sort of lending agreements that put specific restrictions on what you can do with the assets of the stations. Either of those documents have to be uploaded to your public inspection file, or they must be put on a list that's in the public inspection file, and the documents themselves be made available upon request within 7 days. Most stations will choose the latter option, putting in the list rather than uploading all these documents, and they're rarely ever asked for. But if they are asked for, you've got to provide the information within 7 days. So the quarterly issues programs list, I said that I would come back to that. It's on the next slide. The quarterly issues programs list is probably the most scrutinized document that's in your online public inspection, in your online public inspection file. Those quarterly issues programs list, the FCC considers to be extremely important because they're the only official record of the public service programming that you're doing on your radio station. In the old days, some of you may remember back 20 or 30 years ago when you had program logs, when that license renewal time, you had to document how much news programming you did, how much public affairs programming you did, how much how many PSAs you ran on your station. None of that is required anymore. In fact, it hasn't been required for almost 30 years now. Instead, what the FCC has said is you're supposed to document in your quarterly issues programs list the public service programming that's run on your station. So every quarter, on April 10th, July 10th, October 10th, and then on January 10th, you put a document into your public inspection file, and that document lists the most important issues that you see facing your community. The FCC used to say it should be 5 to 10 issues. They no longer specify how many issues, but it's probably a good idea to have 5 issues at least. And those can be issues like traffic, education, drugs, employment, military issues, crime, whatever the issues you see as important to your community, education. Those are the kinds of issues that you list as being important to your community. These are issues that you either determine through a formal ascertainment process where you go out to interview community leaders about what they think are important issues, or just ones you develop yourself through the knowledge of your own staff about the issues that are facing your community. You don't have to do the formal ascertainment, but you should develop these issues and then come up with programs that address those issues. And those programs need to be listed on the quarterly issues programs lists. Those programs, you should have several programs that address each of the issues that you've identified. PSAs can be among the programs that address some of the issues that you've identified, but they should never be the only programming that addresses an issue. You should have at least some longer form programming or substantive programs that address each of those issues. Those can be discussions in your news, discussions on that Sunday morning talk program that you've got on your station, where you've got community leaders come in for a long discussion. That can be a discussion that your morning disc jockey has. If traffic is one of the issues that's you identify as facing your community, and he gets stuck in a traffic jam as he's driving to his morning show one morning and starts complaining about it and starts taking calls from the public about all the traffic problems in your area and what the Highway Commission should be doing to fix up the traffic in your area. That's a discussion of a community issue, even though it happened in what's normally an entertainment program, your radio morning show. The identification of the programs in your quarterly issues programs list should be the title of the program, the duration of the program, the duration of the discussion, the time at which it aired, and a brief description of what it is that that program talked about, so that somebody reading your public inspection file can know that on at 6 o'clock on Tuesday, July 2nd, you talked for 2 minutes in your evening news program about the opioid crisis facing your community and what your local police department is doing about that opioid crisis. And again, multiple programs to address each issue. Syndicated programming is fine to address community issues. It's better to have some local programs, but you can use syndicated programming as well. In the last license renewal cycle, these were the biggest sources of fines, not having quarterly issues programs list for the entire renewal cycle. At the end, when you're filing your renewal, you should have over 30 of these in your public inspection file, reaching back to 2012 when your last license renewal was granted. Every quarter's public inspection file should be, or every quarter's quarterly issues programs list should be in your public inspection file. In the last license renewal cycle, if you were missing more than 3 or 4 of them, the FCC would fine your station between $10,000 and $15,000 for missing more than 3 or 4 of the renewal, the quarterly issues programs list. Of course, at that point, you were reporting yourself, saying, hey, we're missing these documents because you couldn't certify that your public file was complete, when in fact it wasn't. You want to lie to the commission. It's the worst possible thing you can do. You can lose your license for lying, and if you don't have documents in your file, you're just going to get a fine. So you had to tell the truth. But nobody would check on you to see whether those quarterly issues programs lists weren't there. Now, with the online public inspection file, the FCC and anybody else can check on you without having to go to your station's main studio and look at that old physical public inspection file. We've already seen 2 cases where there were fines $15,000 each. One was a 91-year-old guy who was the sole employee at a station in Western Virginia on an AM station. The guy claimed he was computer illiterate, didn't know how to use a computer, much less upload documents to your public inspection file. The guy had health problems. The FCC said, tough luck. You had no quarterly issues programs list in your public inspection file. He apparently had the same problem and got fined for it. In his last license renewal, the FCC said $15,000 fine, and you're getting a renewal for only 2 years, which means he's got to go through the whole process again in 2 years. The second station was a non-commercial religious station that had no quarterly issues programs list for its entire license renewal period. Again, a $15,000 fine and a 2-year short-term renewal. John, I think you may have wanted to say a few words about what you're seeing in your alternate inspections.
Yes, thank you, David. One of the biggest things that I see is the public inspection file quarterly issues programs list. It seems to be more predominant when you get into smaller companies or standalone ownerships or smaller markets than it is in the larger markets with the large groups. But very rarely do I go into a small market that there is not issues with the quarterly issues programs where they may miss a quarter or 2, or I've seen some cases where they miss 2 or 3 years worth. So we've looked at different public files around the state, and I would say the numbers are in excess of probably 50 stations or more that may have extreme issues here. So it's something that the ownership and management can't take very lightly, because we have no way of knowing how the commission's going to be looking at this once license renewals are filed.
Yeah, it appears the FCC may be giving some leniency to stations if they're doing a good job in the last couple of cycles coming into the license renewal. If they appear to be making a concerted attempt to be in compliance with these rules. So we've seen a couple of renewals that have been granted for stations that had some gaps in the past, but where the last 2 years worth of quarterly issues programs list were uploaded, even if not, some of them may have been uploaded a little late. We can't guarantee that the commission will continue to have that leniency going forward, but certainly if you're missing quarterly issues programs lists, go back and create them to the extent that you can for the last couple of quarters based on programming that you know ran during those quarters. Identify in the documents that these were recreated because you're missing the actual documents from the relevant time period, and upload them now so that when the FCC is reviewing your renewal, they will see that you are making a concerted attempt to be in compliance and may have some leniency. If you do nothing, if you're behind and just throw up your hands and say, oh my gosh, I'm behind, I'll never catch up, and don't make any attempt even, then I think you're certainly risking more fines.
And as Dave said, it's very important in that situation not to certify that your online public file is accurate and up to date. You need to answer that question, no, that it is not accurate. Your online public file is not complete and up to date. And you need to upload an explanation of which files are missing, your efforts to recreate them. You need to be upfront with the FCC, not hide any of the facts. It's much worse to make a false certification on your renewal than to come clean and explain what happened.
False certifications are treated as lies by the FCC, and lying is the worst thing you can do to the FCC. If you lie to the FCC, they can take your license away. If you're missing a couple quarterly issues programs list, you're going to get a monetary fine, possibly a short-term renewal, but you're going to get a renewal. If you lie, you may not get the renewal, and your license can be a problem. So go through the file and identify gaps and be honest about it, and promise to do better and try to upload documents that are missing now before the December 2 filing deadline, so that you can show that you're trying to be in compliance. Other certifications, including...
Let's go to the next slide.
Yeah. You'll be making a number of other certifications, including the one that your public inspection file is complete and up to date and that everything was timely uploaded, including the certifications that all of your ownership reports were filed on time or were filed with the FCC. You've got to make a certification that the station's currently operating. You've got to also make a certification that there weren't periods of time where the station was off the air for substantial periods, for periods of more than 30 days. Why that's important is because the FCC, in some recent cases, has been taking actions against stations that have been off the air for more than half of their license renewal period and giving them short-term renewals, or in some cases, potentially if they've been off the air for almost the entire license renewal period, taking licenses away. But you've got to disclose it if you've been operating for any temporary reason, or not operating your station for any temporary reason during the license renewal term for more than 30 days. The FCC also asked you to certify that there have been no fines issued against the station for FCC violations. When you're certifying that there have been no FCC violations found at your station, that means FCC violations found by the FCC at your station. If John and one of the alternate inspections find that there were some problems at your station and you fix those, you can certify that there were no violations at the station, even if there were and were fixed up. But if the FCC itself had found something, a problem at your station, that your tower lights weren't lit or something else, then you've got to disclose it in this form. You've got to certify that there have been no character issues involving the licensee or any attributable owner of the licensee. Attributable owners include shareholders of more than 5%, any general partner, any limited partner or member of an LLC that hasn't been specifically insulated from control in the operation of your station, any officer or any director of your licensee company. All of those are attributable owners, and you need to be able to certify that none of them has had an adverse finding relating to any felony, any media antitrust issue, any discrimination complaint, or any fraud before any other government agency. And so that's important. If you've got a member of your board of directors and an investor in your station who's a local car dealer and he had a finding by the state employment commission that he had discriminated based on age or based on the sex of one of his employees or something like that, you've got to disclose it even though it happened at his car dealership. So one of the things that you're going to need to do is check out all your attributable owners to make sure that they don't have any of these problems. You're going to need to certify that you're in compliance with the alien ownership requirements, and you're also going to have to certify that you're in compliance with the environmental rules, including that there's no high RF radiation at your transmitter site. John, you want to talk about some of those engineering issues that you're certifying?
Certainly. When you go out to your transmitter site, it has to be, if it's an AM site, fenced in around each one of the towers, and the fences should be secure so that no one could climb over the fence or through the fence or under the fence. And that means that all the gates need to be locked. The commission, when they do inspections, they hand out fines on a regular basis for fences that are not locked. Also, you need signage around your fences. And if there are people that, say, a large Hispanic population or a Korean population that live in the immediate area, you should have those signs both in both languages so that there is no mistake to keep anyone from climbing over those fences. If you're on a rooftop or you're in a multi-user site, again, for FM, for example, in addition to having a fence around the tower, just as good engineering practice and to meet OSHA standards, they should be signed as well, too. AM especially is where the commission really looks because you have radiation on the ground more so than you do with FM, which is usually in the air and 3 to 1,000 or even higher foot tower. If by some chance you do have a site that's on a rooftop, that has to be secured, and you have to be ensured that building management keeps that area secured and that you check it on a regular basis and signage posted. So those are a couple of examples of the radiation type things that we're looking at. And do you want to get into the worksheets now, or do you want to do that in a few minutes, David?
Yeah, I don't know that we need to get into the worksheets other than maybe describe it generally, if you want to describe them very generally. Because we are
okay, and very general terms, on your license renewal form, they are going to ask you about this. And essentially, if there have been no changes in your transmitter site, in other words, it's the same AM tower, the same power, nothing has changed since the last license renewal, and you had no issues there, and you could still check, okay. Same thing with your FM site, no changes in the antenna or any of the equipment or anything with that site. But for example, if you share a tower and say there's a TV on the tower and an FM, and the TV went through repack, then a new radiation study would have to be made. Now, in all cases, the TV station is going to have to provide such a study with their application for license. And it would be a possibility that you might be able to get a copy of that study, and then by utilizing that study, you could determine that your facility is safe as well. And of course, you would be able to check yes on the FCC inspection form. But simplistically, if there have been no changes in the transmitter site that you have your FM or your AM at, you should not have to worry about doing a new study. But if there have been any changes whatsoever, you do need to look closely at that. Thank you, David.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, John. And in fact, the one thing that I've seen a couple of times is AM licensees having to run out the week before they file their license renewal to set their fence back up because they're certifying they're in compliance with the environmental rules. They have to have a fence that's up, keeping people out of there, and it's got a locked gate on it. So check out those fences now so you're not running around having to run out to Home Depot to buy some fencing the week before your renewal.
We had a question come in through the chat group while we were talking about these engineering issues. It goes back to the online public file question, and I'll just address it here before we go on to the next slide. So the question is, someone has already filed their renewal application. There were some gaps in the public inspection file, but they were filled in and updated before filing the renewal application, and the applicant certified that the file was in order. The question is, do you need to go back and amend the renewal to say that these portions of the file were uploaded late? And I think the answer is yes. You do need to amend your renewal application and change your certification about the online public file to say no, they were not timely uploaded. So you can file an amendment to your renewal application. It's the same approach in LMS. You just amend the application by clicking on the application. And so you should go back, amend the renewal application, disclose what needs to be disclosed in a PDF that you upload to the attachment section of the application, which we'll show you in some of these slides going on. But yes, that does need to be amended. Let's go to the next slide, slide 11.
Great. So another thing that you should be doing now as you file your license renewal, prepare to file your license renewal, is go through all your FCC records to make sure that the FCC has your licensee name correct, it's got your address correct, your call letters are correct, your city of license is correct, and consistent all through the FCC's filing different databases. We've seen situations where contact people or employees that long ago left, that mailing addresses or addresses at studios that haven't been the effective address for ages, and therefore the station is not going to be getting information or questions from the FCC if they've got questions about your license renewal. So make sure all the information is correct and consistent in all the FCC databases. Make sure you've got all your FCC identifiers correct, the right facility ID number, you know your FCC registration number, you know how to get into the LMS system and register to use that, and so that you can upload your application. It's also, on the next slide, a good time to do just a technical review of your station. The FCC is not necessarily going to be doing a technical review, but again, anybody can object. And in fact, as we'll talk about in just a moment, you'll be running public notices on your station telling people they can object about your operations. So you want to make sure that everything is correct at your station, including that you've got all the authority to do everything that you're doing in connection with your station, making sure your STLs are properly licensed to transmit from your current studio to your current transmitter site, that your remote pickups are all correctly licensed, that any boosters are authorized, any translators are being operated from the right place. Make sure that if you're using non-broadcast spectrum, private radio, satellite dishes that have their own licenses, they're not renewed. With these renewals, you've got to look at and see what the renewal deadlines are for those, because private radio and satellite have different deadlines. They're not associated with the broadcast deadlines. Make sure that you've paid all your regulatory fees, because if you haven't paid your regulatory fees, the FCC won't process your license renewal. And there was a case recently where years later, because they hadn't processed the license renewal, the guy lost his license because the FCC could never process the renewal because he'd never paid his regulatory fees.
Let's go to slide 13.
The next slide starts talking about what you should already be doing in connection with the pre-filing announcements. You should have run on the 1st and 16th of October and the 1st of November pre-filing announcements. A standard text that the FCC has set out in their renewals in connection with their license renewal that tells listeners that you'll be filing your license renewal on December 2nd, that they can look at your public file and that they can file comments on the license renewal. If you haven't already done those announcements on the 1st and 16th of October and the 1st of November, you're later going to have to put an affidavit of performance essentially in your public file, certifying as to when these announcements were run. Run a whole bunch of them now, extra ones.
Daily,
Daily, right.
Your renewal.
Until you filed your renewal, so that when you're certifying that you run your public announcements, you can say, well, we didn't, but we ran a whole bunch more to inform the public at other times when the public would be listening. After you've done the pre-filing announcements, obviously by December 2nd, on the next slide, it'll tell you that you got to file your license renewal. File it on or before December 2nd. You'll have to file the EEO Form 396 actually before the renewal, because when you file the 396, you get an identification number that's actually filled into a blank on the license renewal, and the electronic system won't let you file a license renewal until you filled in that identification number from the Form 396. Make sure that that's on file, and then for the next 3 months, during the month of filing, December, in January and February, on the 1st and the 16th of each month, you're running post-filing announcements. Those post-filing announcements are just like the pre-filing announcements. They say on such and such a date you filed your license renewal. It's available for public inspection, and people can file comments at the FCC in Washington. It's inviting people to look at your public inspection file. At the end of the last announcement on the 16th of February, within 7 days, get a certification into your public inspection file that lists all the dates and times that all your pre- and post-filing announcements were run. After you've done all of that, on the next slide, you sit back and wait. The public has got 3 months from the December 1st deadline to file comments or petitions or objections to your license renewal. If you, for any reason, miss that December 2nd filing deadline, it's 3 months from the date of public notice, which could be a week after you actually file the license renewal to object to your license renewal. Any objection can take months, sometimes years to resolve, and in that entire period, you're not going to be able to sell your station. You may have trouble getting refinancing from banks if there's questions out there. So there may be problems. There may be questions from the FCC, especially if there's any enforcement issues pending against your station, or if there's serious problems with your public inspection file. If you've made any false certifications that the FCC discovers or anybody else brings to light, you may have all sorts of problems that may keep this license from being granted. But if you've got no obvious problems, look for the license to be granted sometime in March. And in March, if it hasn't been granted by April 1st, which is when your license expires, and you don't know any reason that it's been held up, it's not a bad idea to call or have your attorney call to find out why it's been held up. Because if there's a problem that needs fixing, then you can go and see why it needs to be fixed.
We had a question come in on the chat line. Is there a renewal fee for non-commercial educational stations? No fee for non-commercial stations. Commercial stations do have to pay roughly 170 per station, but non-commercial stations are off the hook, no fee. Let's go to the next slide.
Right, so we're just going to flash through a couple of pictures of what the application looks like. For the most part, this first page is just general information. It asks whether or not you're filing attachments, whether you've got any waiver requests that you're filing with this application. That would be things like newspaper, radio cross ownership, or any multiple ownership waivers, or anything like that, which for the most part is not going to take place. If you're asking for a fee waiver because you're in bankruptcy. On the next slide, we get into sort of the guts of the application, where you're making certifications that there have been no character issues against any of your principals. That's what we were talking about before, about any sort of, actually we didn't talk about character issues. That's if there's been any FCC findings against any of the principals in your applications that said that they had lied to the FCC or had other problems where licenses were canceled. In the adverse findings, that's where you're talking about the criminal violations or discrimination complaints that have been resolved against any of your attributable owners. The FCC violations during the preceding license renewal terms, that's the actual findings by the FCC that you had violated any of their rules. A certification that you've complied with the alien ownership rules, and a certification that you're not discriminating in advertising sales. That's the requirement, that in your advertising sales contracts, you're saying we're not discriminating against minority groups by accepting advertising that cuts out certain minority groups or certain advertisers, and we're not taking advertising from people that have no urban, no Spanish dictates saying that they don't want advertising that reaches minority organizations from your station.
And because a lot of your sales practices are now conducted over email, we recommend that your sales teams have a non-discrimination disclosure in their signature block of their email, so that every single time they send out an email, that non-discrimination disclosure is in there. It makes it a lot easier from the time of renewal to make this certification that Dave was talking about.
On the next page, we talked about some of the additional certifications, that you filed your biennial ownership reports on time. We talked about that earlier. That you've done your EEO program reports, that filed with 396 and put your public inspection file reports into your public inspection file as required. If you were late with your EEO annual public inspection file reports, here's where you'd have to say, oops, we've reported those, filed some of those late. The online public inspection file, here's the disclosure that you put everything into the public inspection file on a timely basis. If you haven't, then you have to provide an explanation. The next three all deal with the questions that we were talking about you either not being on the air or not being on the air the number of hours that are required under the FCC's rules for a station of your class to be on the air, which is usually most of the operating hours between 6 a.m. and midnight every day. And then finally, on that page, the environmental effects. That's the issues that John was talking to you earlier about, principally regarding RF radiation. On the next page, there's a certification or a question about whether this application includes any translator stations that are rebroadcasting the main stations. You can renew translators on the same application form as the main station, as long as that translator is in the same license renewal group or a later license renewal group than your main station. But if you've got an AM station or an FM station with a translator that happens to be in South Carolina or in Florida that's already had their license renewal, hopefully you've already filed that translator license renewal, because if it's in a preceding license term, you're supposed to have already filed it.
I'll just make one comment about the announcements for FM translators. As Dave was saying, your pre-filing and post-filing announcements for full power stations are just made over the air. But there is a special rule for FM translators at renewal time. you have to publish in a newspaper, a local newspaper, one time only, after you file your renewal application for the FM translator. You have to publish a notice in the newspaper about that renewal application. So that is a little quirk with FM translators, but it's one not to ignore.
On the next page,
David,
Yeah.
if I may interrupt, one thing, we do have a lot of people that may not own the translator that's associated with their particular radio station. They may be leasing that transmitter, and it would be under different ownership. So you want to be sure that the actual owner is filing the license renewal for their translator, or something could happen and they lose that license.
That's a good point, John. Yeah, you should only be filing for licenses that you own, and making sure that if you're leasing one, that the licensee of that station is filing its own renewal.
and then at the end of the license renewal, you're making a general certification, basically that everything that you said in all these other questions is true and correct. And that the party who's signing the application, whose name will be in the certification at the end, which is on the next slide, is authorized to sign on behalf of the licensee. This is the catch-all. If any reason, anything that you said earlier is not correct, the FCC can get you because you've got to certify that to these facts before you file your application with the FCC. If you move on, there's also a brief look at the EEO program report, the Form 396 on the next slide, which, as I said, basically requires general information about the station to be completed, a contact person at the station. Make sure it's somebody who, when they get a call from the FCC, is going to respond to that call and know that they need to respond to the FCC. And on the next slide, there's that question that everybody, whether you've got 5 full-time employees or not, needs to answer about whether you've had any pending or resolved complaints during the license renewal term dealing with discrimination. Note that in this form, it's any pending or resolved complaints. Back in the license renewal form, where you're certifying none of your attributable owners has had any adverse finding of discrimination, it's an actual finding of discrimination. On this form, it's anything that's either been found to be discriminatory or is still pending. And then you make the certification about whether or not you've had 5 full-time employees or not, and then attach the required documents and have an authorized party whose name is there. On the next slide, we provide you with some resources that you can look at for questions that may come up during license renewal. Here's our commercial announcement. Our blog, the Broadcast Law blog, is where David and I write about lots of legal issues that affect broadcasters as issues that come up during license renewal surface, when the FCC has fined somebody or made clear that there's some problems with license renewals. We'll often highlight those in some of our articles. The FCC also has a good website where they have a license renewal guide for radio at the link that's provided here on this slide. And then finally, we've got our contact information. That's the number for our law firm and our email addresses where we can be reached if you've got questions about any of these issues. Any last thoughts, Dan?
No, we're happy to take questions either audio or by group chat. We've thrown a lot of information at you, so we're happy to answer some questions. We've got one coming in now. Question is, my station missed a biennial ownership report several years ago. Is it possible to go back and file that? I think it is. It depends. If it's the 2018 one, I think you can. I don't know if you can go back and file an ownership report from CBBS. You may just want to disclose that you didn't file that biennial ownership report. If you have a current one on file, I think you can make the certification that you filed your most recent biennial ownership report. And I would just make a disclosure in the online public file section. You answer the question no, and then you upload a one-page document that just explains which report you missed and why. And if it's just one report, an isolated report, probably not a big issue.
Any other questions?
I see the webinar is being recorded. That's my understanding too. I'm going to turn it over to Mackenzie or Garrett to answer the question about whether it will be available.
So we are recording this whole meeting has been recorded, and we are going to be breaking that down and sending that out to everybody who joined this call. And we're going to be making that available to stations or people who are not able to be on this call. So I am taking that information and sending that to her, and we're going to be working on getting that out as soon as possible.
Great. Who's on the conference call, right?
We do.
We do?
We do.
On both?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So if that's it, thank you, everybody. Bob, did you have anything else you wanted to say?
No, again, I want to thank Dave and Dave for what they did, and thank you very much. And we're here to help you. You're in the final stretch in the next 3 weeks. We're here to help in any way that we can to help everybody get their license renewed. So thank you very much for participating.
Great. Thank you all.
Thank you, everybody.
There's quite a few people getting off. But there wasn't supposed to be a Q&A?
That was a Q&A.
Oh. There were no questions?